let's talk about some non-meristematic tissues, and we're going to spend the rest of this module talking about what are known as the vascular tissues. The vascular tissues are differentiated, which means that they are types of what we call permanent tissues. They're no longer dividing, meaning they're no longer in meristems. They have matured, they have developed certain characteristics that let them do very specific things. And so therefore we say they're differentiated and they are permanent tissues. These vascular tissues make up basically the veins, or what we would refer to as veins and arteries in an animal, of the plant. And they are responsible for moving the various things that the plants make, like sugars and other types of compounds, as well as moving water from the soil up to the leaves. And so they basically form a series of pipes, as we'll see, that connect all the various parts of the plants. There are two types of vascular tissues, and the first one we'll talk about is called the xylem tissue. And xylem is responsible for moving water. Now, as I said in earlier modules, plants get all of their water that they need from the soil. And so xylem water movement tends to be from the soil upward to the leaves. Now, when it pulls this water from the soil, and we'll discuss more about this later, it also pulls up quite a bit of what is dissolved in that soil water, which includes things like nutrients. What's unique about xylem in terms of the vascular tissues is that xylem cells are dead at maturity. Only the cell walls remain. And let's take a look at a slide of some xylem here. This is a longitudinal cross section of some wood, and this region right here is the xylem. Xylem cells grow stacked on top of each other, and they're cylindrical in shape, and when they're mature they die. And as they die, the cell membrane dissipates, all the cell organelles get dissolved, and the ends of these xylem cells also dissolve the cell walls, and so they form these basic pipes and allow water to flow from the roots upwards through these tubes. Xylem often have very thickened fibers associated with them, particularly in woody plants, but you can get the basic idea. Xylem, basically they grow end to end like little sections of pipe, and once they are mature and they stop growing, the ends of the cells dissolve also, and they form basically like little straws or tubes. Water moves into and out of these according to where it wants to go. And we'll talk about that property of water in a few more sections here. Keep in mind that all that remains is the cell walls, which again are porous. It means they're full of holes, and so water can go into or out of this xylem stream, okay, as it pleases, because not only is there not a cell membrane there, which wouldn't stop the water in the first place, but there are numerous holes all in these cell walls. So let's talk about the second type of vascular tissue, which is called the phloem. While the xylem carries water from the roots mainly up to the shoots and eventually to the leaves, phloem basically flows in the opposite direction in that it carries sugars predominantly from the leaves to the roots. keep in mind, the sugars are all made in the leaves. Roots do not photosynthesize. They're underground. They can't even photosynthesize if they wanted to. There's no light down there. So the phloem carries the sugars from the leaves down to the roots so that the root cells have something to respire upon and be able to keep doing their job. Now, phloem's made up of two different types of cells. We've got the sieve tube cells, or I'm just going to write the tube cells. And they're cylindrical with openings on the ends, much like xylem, except the difference is they remain alive. And so, although they're predominantly hollowed out, they do maintain a thin wall of cytoplasm around the outer diameters of the cell. So let's take a look at that. All right, this photo depicts phloem tubes in a corn plant. And you can see here are the phloem tubes, and I'll just point some arrows here. We've got cylindrical, long, tube-shaped cells, and sugars flow through them again down to the roots. Now, I just mentioned that they remain alive, and another type of cell often or always resides next to these tube cells, and they're called the companion cells. Companion cells are also long, but they're not thick. They don't form tubes. They're basically just closely associated with these tube cells. And basically their function is to allow the tube cells to hollow out and have the largest diameter possible for maximum flow. And the reason they can do that is their organelles are stored in these companion cells, and there are numerous plasmodesmata connecting the two cells. Now, why do the phloem cells need to remain alive where the xylem can just stay dead? And by the way, this is some xylem cells right here. They have to remain alive to accomplish what's called phloem loading. And phloem loading basically means loading sugars, loading sugars into or out of the tubes. Why do they have to remain alive to do this? Why can't the sugar just move into and out of these? Well, because the cell membranes of all these cells around it are selectively permeable, which means water, like in the xylem down here, can just go in and out as it pleases. Sugars is a different story. And so for the sugar to get into these tubes in the first place, they have to be pumped or moved across membranes and into the sap stream, as it's called. And so for that reason, these cells must remain alive because it costs the cells some energy to pump those sugars or to load those sugars into the phloem. And so that's why the phloem cells have to remain alive, while the xylem cells over here can be dead at maturity, and it doesn't matter because all they're responsible for is carrying water. And phloem and xylem are always found together. They refer to these bunches of xylem and phloem as vascular tissue. And if we look at a photograph of some actual vascular tissue, this is what it would look like. This is a cross section of a stem of a corn plant looked at under a microscope. And we can see this is a vascular bundle, and they often form these little faces. They look like little cartoon smiley faces almost. What we've got here is their larger diameter cells down in here are the xylem. And these cells up in here are the phloem. And together they make up a so-called vein in this plant. You'll notice with the phloem we've got the tubes, which are larger diameter, and then we've got right here is a smaller companion cell. And so that's a vascular tissue.